going to get started with the Q&A. The lovely Alexander Chee is going to come join me up here. And we each get our own microphone and more. We have so many microphones to choose from, we won't know what to do. And as is, I will be giving a formal introduction to Alex just before the reading begins. But as you know, he's the author of The Queen of the Night and a first novel, Edinburgh. And I will tell you many more exciting things about him. But I thought we would just get started with some questions. And I'll talk, as I so often do, perhaps a little excessively. And once we sort of get the ball rolling, and I think you need this for the film, is that right? For the video, that you need the microphone? Because otherwise, I think I can reach you all, correct? But do you want this, or you don't care?
Yeah, I want the microphone.
You want that, okay. So we'll do that. I think the last time I saw you, we were both ingenues. Alex and I met many years ago when he was teaching at Amherst College and I was teaching at Mount Holyoke. And
10 years.
Yes, and I think we were both writing novels that took us about 10 years to write. I think you were writing.
I was working on this.
Yeah. And I was working on my second novel, The Map of Ireland, and so we've both had that experience of working on something for a really long time, and then the pleasure of seeing it come to fruition. I want to start with some sort of specific questions about the book, and then maybe move out a little bit from there into the writing life and what it means to work on a long project. So one of the things that struck me as I was reading this, or one of the first things, as I was thinking about, of course, opera and what it means to have sort of this operatic form in a novel, or to maybe think about the form of opera colliding with the form of the novel and producing this book. And we're in 19th century, and yet the narrative voice of this, as much as it feels at times quite period, is also feels quite contemporary. And it feels contemporary in its lightness, in its period but not mannered at all. Here's your cappuccino.
Ah, thank you.
It is not kind of burdened with the necessity of proving its 19th centuryness every moment. Its period is established, and then I think it feels in a lot of ways like a contemporary voice and a contemporary narrative that is aware, say, of creating a vibrant fictive dream, but again, unlike some historical novels, isn't working very hard to show us everyone's belt buckle. Right? So I wanted to ask about that tension.
Early on in the process of writing it, I picked up a book by Gore Vidal called 1876, which is set, roughly around the same time as this. It's about a journalist who's returning to the United States from France, where he's been living, and he's married a niece of Napoleon III, and there's an election going on, and it's supposed to be his diary, and it's not particularly diaristic. And pretty soon it's just sort of a novel in this kind of way that feels a little like a betrayal, in a sense. And, I think I used the book as a kind of example of everything I didn't want to do. There was a lot of people talking about things in a way that they would never talk about them from the period, and this sort of cagey, show-offy approach towards representing the research on the page. And Vidal was pretty famous for these fights that he would get into in the pages of the New York Review of Books with people who had reviewed him, and then he would write in, and then they would write back, and there would be these wars. Like one of the most fun things you can do is to just get the digital subscription and read all of his letters to the editor. Because they're hilarious. They're very sharp. I don't know that they've ever been collected, but you can just click through the website and see them. But the point being that, like, you know, I think I wanted something that had more the feeling of an intimate document in some ways from that time. And so the thing that was remarkable to me was reading, say, the letters of Giuseppe Verdi. She felt very present to me. She felt very much like a contemporary of ours. You know, the letters she wrote they were very funny. She would also detail like that was where I got all the information about what Giuseppe Verdi required in terms of food when he traveled. You know, like this,
Right.
how he had to have and one thing that I wasn't able to really put in there was that I wanted to, I don't think, was he would get these special Italian hams for his friends and then send them to them with instructions on how to prepare them, and then he would write to them and he'd be like, "How's the ham?" like, he really was one of those friends who would like give you the present and then you had to sort of enjoy it, perform the enjoyment of it for him. That was part of the present. And you know, so this was all very. Once you find those kinds of details, you found the key towards making that particular august personage seem like a real person on the page. And then once that happens, then it does feel, as you say, light or modern, or you know, it's not like it's about finding those particular sorts of details more than it is about the other stuff. So you know, like another source that I used was there was a hilarious autobiography or memoir of a British governess who had lived inside of the Tuileries Palace, taking care of the children of the Duke and Duchess de Tascher. And the subtitle of it was something like "A Prisoner of the Tuileries." And she had so much dirt about the Empress in there. It was fantastic. People who disliked Eugenie really disliked her, and they loved telling stories about it. So, you know, one of my favorites. I loved reading the Goncourt journals. The brothers Goncourt. They were both writers, and they wrote together until one of them died, and then the other one considered quitting and then kept going without him. And they kept these wonderfully smart, vivid diaries of life during that period, especially the literary life of that period. So there's all this great gossip about like Zola and about Flaubert, and then also the Princess Mathilde, who was part of the court of Napoleon. And Princess Mathilde hated Eugenie and was always telling stories about how horrible and stupid she was, and it was just, anyway, I had a great time reading it all, and you just sort of soak in all of that, and you're looking after that ambient sense of it, and then at some point it becomes something that you can transmit, you know. And you know, some things were intuitive, some things were very calculated, you know. So like, what would have been the gossip that the servants would have known based on the gossip that the Goncourt brothers were telling? So, for example, the way the emperor, when he had women brought to him, they were never allowed to kiss him, and they had to disrobe entirely before he arrived. You know, there was usually like one evening with them, and then they were gone. And that was fascinating. It's such like a sort of dehumanizing, assiduous approach to his erotic life.
Right.
You know, like.
So maybe a question connected to that. So here you are immersed or immersing yourself in this other time period and being attentive to historical detail and historical accuracy, and some things, as you said, very calculated, other things that you're going to be inventing. My sense about working in history is, or working with historical material, is that you're not just sort of talking to us or telling us something about this particular period, but you're also telling us about the world that we're living in now.
Correct.
And so I'm wondering what sort of issues that you're struggling with, or what, and I can sort of throw out one, right, the sort of reinvention of the self. Our heroine keeps transforming. Now she's a circus rider, now she's a child who can sing but not speak, now she's a courtesan, now she's, etc. So things that you were grappling with that you're speaking to in the past but also feel current.
One of the big fascinations for me about this material was the way in which women celebrities at the time had access to more freedoms than other women of the period, but only as long as they were able to provide whatever spectacle created the celebrity that they had. And once it was over, it was over.
Mm-hmm.
So like, when the empire fell, all of Eugenie's power vanishes, right? She flees and she's chased out of the palace by hordes who would have killed her. And Iliad is very aware that when she loses her voice, she's just eccentric. She has no more, she doesn't really, if she has other talents, she's not really aware of them, or they don't have that kind of same durable power. And so these transformations she goes through are in some ways related to this way in which she is simply in search of some acknowledgement of her humanity that she doesn't even know how to define, in a sense. So like, one of the big influences on this in the background, she's here as a minor character, but she was a big influence, was the writer George Sand, who was a tremendous presence at the time, and then over time has become a sort of caricature. This woman wearing pants with a cigar, going into gentlemen's clubs. If you don't know anything about her, you might have read a book by her in a feminist lit class, possibly. Is there anyone here who's read any of her work? Maybe. Not even a little. So she wrote sometimes 3 novels a year. She was the first woman in France to successfully sue for divorce. She did it so that she could go and be a writer. And she made her living as a writer for the rest of her life. She was so influential in Russia that they had something that they called George Sandism, which they made into a word with several Z's to to Russianize it. And she had a huge influence on writers as different as like Dostoevsky and Brontes, and they were all reading her, and now we all read that when we don't read her, and she's just sort of lost to us.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that she was very much a part of, both inspiring and writing about, was this idea of the new woman, which was a kind of woman who had not existed before, as far as she could tell, who had more independence and more of her humanity and more of herself.
The woman she was inventing.
Well, inventing as she was going along, yeah, pretty much. So the wearing of the pants, if you know anything about her, you might know that she wore pants. At the time in France, it was illegal to wear pants if you were a woman. You could be arrested for it, and in public. And she wore them. She basically went in a kind of male drag so that she could go to men's clubs and participate in the intellectual life of the day and have intellectual conversations, intellectual fights and feuds. And she just did whatever she wanted, and she was sometimes banned. Sometimes there were fights that she had with the government about the work that she was doing. But yeah, I was trying to imagine a woman who, I suppose, needed her when I was imagining Liliet. I knew what George Sand's struggle was. What was it? But her struggle was mitigated in part by social class. So she was an interesting figure in that she was the child of someone who had a noble lineage, and then a woman who was essentially like a dance hall girl / prostitute, sometime prostitute. And she lived in a beautiful home that she had inherited. Excuse me. And so she had these kinds of buttresses, but if you didn't have that, if you had no, if you had none of those things going for you, then what were you? What would you have to do? And that was what I was trying to invent, but also trying to do it in a mode that was not a realist mode either.
Right. So there's this sort of constant reinvention of the self that's happening, and which is in some ways very much a part of an opera tradition where the characters are transforming and not who we think they are, and etc. And I guess I'm wondering about, and maybe this is too abstract a question, but I'm wondering about the anxiety behind that reinvention, right? Like on some level, she begins as a Minnesota farm girl, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can see that reinvention as very American. And one of my questions was, why opera now, right? What is opera telling us about kind of our current moment? And when I was thinking about this problem of reinvention and multiple selves, I was thinking, of course, about technology and the internet and the different ways that we multiply ourselves all the time through this technology.
Sure, digital persona.
Right. Mm-hmm. Was there an anxiety, was there a 19th century anxiety about multiple selves, or an anxiety about a not real self, or a transforming self?
I don't really think I thought of it that way at all. I mean, I think I approached it, when I approached opera, I approached it essentially for the way in which there were these outsized tragedies that the singers performed in.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, my brother was in love with an opera singer at a certain point in our life in New York together. And so I would go with him a lot to City Opera to watch all these operas with him while he...
This was an unrequited love, I think.
Yeah.
More or less, yeah.
Which was weird. I don't know why she didn't like him. But anyway, I got to see a lot of opera. And I really enjoyed her as a singer, and I remember thinking about how strange the plots were because they were so crazy, like really, really crazy. Any one of them that you pick out of the classics, has all of these ups and downs, and sometimes many personae are adopted by the main character, disguises and so on. And so then I started thinking about, like, what if that was your life? What would that be like? Because the idea behind those stories is that, right, the idea of, which comes forward in the novel, that those chosen to have these stories told about them were picked by the gods, like be made examples of, in a sense, for their hubris. So what was it like to be inside of that? And I came across these two quotes that were very, very far apart in time from Joan Didion and Oscar Wilde, where they said, well, what you write comes true. The fiction that you write comes true is essentially what they were saying. And so then I thought,
there's a terrifying notion.
right, but what if you were writing operas? Like, what would that be like? And so these were the kinds of ways that I was playing around with the idea in my head as I came up with this idea of an opera singer who becomes convinced that she is doomed to repeat the fates of the characters she portrays. And also, within that there was some way in which I was also writing about the period that I had just come out of with publishing my first novel, which I had structured deliberately using Aristotle's principles for tragedy, the poetics, and the way in which people, they could sense that parts of it were autobiographical, but they didn't know how to talk to me about it. And then part of the reason why I had structured it that way was because the actual things that had happened to me, like I put them all in at the beginning, and my agent was like, no one's going to believe this many terrible things happened to one person. And I was like, well, that is interesting. So in some ways, Edinburgh as a novel is kind of a nicer story than like what actually happened to me as a person. So that was also interesting to me. Also, like this idea of someone who's performing in a tragedy, but who has a very different tragedy behind her, and how she would think about that. Because the whole novel is her trying to sort of figure all of these things out in relationship to each other, thinking through all of these ideas. And I think that's another piece of fiction writing that is not really discussed enough, which is the way in which telling a story about something is a way of thinking about it.
Right.
That it's often, what we do is often treated like something that is non-intellectual. That if it has intellectual value, its value is accidental. Especially by our colleagues in certain academic settings.
Indeed. Right.
So it's, that's starting to change, thank God, or thank all of our work, really, actually, not God. But it's still a fight that we're having within the culture, I think.
So maybe one more question before I open it up. So I'm wondering about those kind of cul-de-sacs that we can get into sometimes as writers, where we have a conceit, we have an idea about, I want to structure this according to Aristotle's Poetics, or I as a tragedy, I want to structure this in terms of a particular opera, I guess that difficulty between intuition and an intellectual commitment, when perhaps that intellectual commitment isn't working out on the page.
When it is not working out?
When it's not working out on the page.
When it's not working out yet, as I like to say. So like, in other words, how did I work with this?
Yeah, right.
Well, so early on I thought it would be so interesting to try to make a novel out of the Magic Flute. And so I got the libretto, and then I read the libretto, and I thought, this is a terrible idea, and I am not doing it. And then I kept writing the novel, and about 4 years later, I checked in with the libretto again, and I could see how this character and this character matched up with this character and this character, and you know, there are all these ways in which I had sort of created a kind of, I had taken the things that were in the opera and put them inside of, they had populated the landscape in a way that was more interesting than the way that I might have done it, which I was grateful for, but which was strange. You know, as an opera, the Magic Flute doesn't really make a lot of sense as a story. Like, in terms of a story about a hero who's out to, like, you know, save the day and win the girl and all those kinds of things. Like, he's hapless. The Magic Flute is never used to any purpose in the opera. It doesn't save him. It doesn't save anyone, actually. It doesn't even get him inside of the wizard's palace, really. So it's a weird sort of distraction. And what you can see, however, is you can see this young man who is propped up by more powerful women who rely on him for who knows what reason, and he doesn't even offer them the barest minimum of loyalty. He like betrays them like that, and you can see this, you know, this woman who he's supposed to be in love with. At one point, she nearly escapes, but someone's like, "Oh, wait, this guy's coming for you. He's in love with you," and she's like, "Really?" And so then she waits for him. And these are the things that are happening. It's supposed to be charming, and in fact, when they're all singing and it's happening, and you're like, "Oh, that's kind of cute, isn't it?" And but then afterwards, it's not cute. It's chilling. It has a kind of horrifying quality. This way in which all these women are sort of tipped over for all of these really worthless men. So, so I was thinking about it, and then I thought, oh my God, it's the first realist opera. It's like the whole but it's dressed up like a fairy tale.
Right.
And so that's sort of, I guess if you can imagine, like, that is a way, through a weird mirror, that is the novel in a sense.
Yeah. Well, that's lovely. That's a lovely way to think about it, a lovely window. So, questions from you? And please introduce yourself to Alex.
You pointed at me?
Yes, sorry.
Hi, I'm Braun. I'm an MFA student, third year in fiction. I am about 50 pages away from the end of The Queen of the Night, so I haven't obviously had a chance for it to set
So no
properly. I was wondering about Liliette, kind of from a craft perspective of character. She's such a shapeshifter, and there's about 10 different Liliettes, but there still is a core to her. And I was wondering if you had that conception from the very beginning, or not, and how it changed over the years you were writing the novel.
When I first, had the idea for her, I had the idea of an opera singer who had retired into a circus, traveling on a train at night, sneaking off to like hang out with the elephants, and thinking about her past, and having secrets that she wasn't sure she would share with anyone, and that was really, those were some of the pages that you're about to get to, or the ending, are like the oldest pieces of the novel, in some ways. And, it was part of the original conception of her, because I was interested in these kinds of women that I would read about in the edges of things that I was reading from that period. These incredibly adventurous, sometimes bawdy women who were often not the center of the action. And I couldn't figure out why at first, because I thought, well, that's the interesting one, right? The lover of the emperor who can walk on her hands and like used to be a hippodrome rider. Like, let's go talk to her. Who cares about whether or not this other girl's going to get married? Like, but that was a kind of way in which a lot of that literature operated about the stories of women. The stories of women back then were typically the story of the one thing that ever happened to this woman, and it was related to whether she got married or not. Now, I found some of the one of the big documents that was very helpful was the memoirs of Celeste Mogador, who was the inspiration for Carmen. And she started out as a prostitute very early in life. She was just barely not a girl, and she was sort of tricked into prostitution because her mother left her behind when she ran off with a boyfriend, and the only person who was looking after her was a prostitute, and the police caught them together, and she was forcibly registered as a prostitute. And she was a can-can dance hall queen, 19th century dance battles, which were awesome. She became a hippodrome rider to try to get out of the registry. It was like if you could prove that you had gainful employment outside of being a prostitute, you could get the police to let you off the registry. She married her most noble lover, who was probably disinherited by his family, and then they went to Australia for the gold rush, which fell apart. And then he died there while she was supporting them by writing novels and plays. And then she moves back to France, and then she inspires the character of Carmen. So, because she's like Bizet's next door neighbor. So, that is a really interesting woman. That is a woman who a lot of things happen to. And, the memoirs that exist of hers cover the period of her life up until she leaves for Australia with her husband. And she wrote them because the court ordered her to write them to help. It was such a French thing in a way, like, you must write your memoir to help pay off your debts. Like, what a weird thing to require. But then she publishes them. I know, right? Then she publishes them, and then it's like, this is obscene, we are banning this. But the memoir is not actually that obscene when you read it. It's not salacious. It's actually very, to the extent that it's obscene, it describes things like the unfair treatment of women by men back then, the way that they were property, the way that if you married a man and he was abusing you and you ran away, the police would return you to him like your property, or the way in which your husband could forcibly sell you into prostitution and make you have sex with other men for money. These kinds of things. And so that's the sort of the way in which a woman would become a celebrity to escape from that became very interesting as a result. So there's this way in which the things that seem very frivolous, like her dresses and the jewels and the ways that she creates this kind of public persona, all of it is happening around this way in which, if all of that falls apart, she goes back there. And so all those personae are about her various attempts essentially to escape those fates. Yes?
Hi, my name is Lauren. I'm a second year MFA student, primarily writing fiction. And my question is kind of about what you chose, which moments you chose to hone into, especially when Lilith was a young girl and her family was dying of this illness. And one of the things that haunts me so much is pushing her mother's casket up this hill. And I mean, that in itself could have been a whole book. So how did you know what to focus on and when was enough and to move on with the rest of the story?
That was hard.
Yeah.
That's another one of the old parts of the novel. And when I wrote it, I knew my father had died when I was 15, and he died in the winter, and we were in Maine, and that was when I learned that at that time now there's actually some sort of incredible machine that you can put on the ground in winter that can melt the earth enough so that you can eventually bury someone in winter. But in the 70s in Maine, we had no such thing. So we had to wait until the spring to bury my father. And so that was in some ways one of the more, like the source of that information is some of the most autobiographical, I guess you could say. It's very difficult to know, I suppose, what to include and what not to include. I remember a workshop I had as a grad student at Iowa with Marilyn Robinson, where she said, you have to, she put it, these are not the significant scenes of this story. And I thought, it really blew my mind, this idea that the story could be right, but the scenes I had described were wrong. I had taken the reader into the wrong places, in a sense. I think in a general way, the principle of a dramatic scene is that you're after a kind of the description of the otherwise ineffable calculus of the way in which humans interact with each other. So the way in which we are all made of things that we can and cannot change, a mix of them, and the things that we want and are afraid of at any given time, and then there are the internal events and the external events for each of us as people, and then all that mixes into the event that we try to describe in a particular piece of fiction. So you're tracing something that has a perhaps less than obvious line to someone else, but you're tracing what you can see of it, if that makes sense. And I'm thinking, like one of the lessons I learned with my first novel was that it was something that I had written to fit the shape of what I knew, but that from the life that I had lived, but that would not be described by describing the life that I had lived. And
Say that one more time.
sure. I had written something to describe what I had learned from the life that I had lived, but that, like, describing the life that I had lived would not describe what I had learned.
What you learned, okay.
Yeah. So the fiction was, in a sense, a way to articulate that into an existence that wouldn't have come from, say, a memoir about the same kinds of events. And that lesson was very useful, I think, in relationship to trying to decide, like the overall learning of, like, what do I include, what do I not include. I remember at one point in the writing of the novel that I had all these vivid scenes in my head that were not on the page, and I was very dissatisfied with the draft. And then I said to myself, literally, what is wrong with you that you are not writing these scenes that are in your head? Like, that is the whole point, is that you write them down. Like, so then I made a list, and I started focusing on that. I don't know why I was stuck like that. I don't know what sort of strange autopilot I was on, but it was something, I remember I showed a draft to a friend of mine, and she said, you're a good enough writer that you can fake your way through this stuff, but you shouldn't, you should really go back to, like, what actually matters to it. I think in revision, that's when you sort of isolate each section and you say, okay, what is this doing? Why is this described? Does this have to be here? What does this provide that this doesn't provide? Or vice versa. I was talking to a student today who, she has a novel, The Middle Sags, and she was trying to figure out what to do with it. And I said, pacing problems are information problems, essentially, like where the reader doesn't know why you're telling them what you're telling them. And so the question is, like, what is happening with the pace of information here that needs your attention? so part of that piece of information may be scenes that should be described that are not described. Might be something else. Oh, one thing that I did learn with this book, especially about chapters, that I think also helps with this is it's very helpful for the overall momentum of the novel if each chapter answers and asks a question as it goes through. At least one of each.
More questions?
Don't be shy.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Matt, first year MFA. It's interesting because Stephanie mentioned that we don't see every person's belt buckle, but
Right.
I'm very early on in the book, so again, no spoilers, but we spend, especially that first scene, we spend a great deal of time on our protagonist's dress.
Yes.
And I loved that decision. I thought it said a lot about what you were saying about our character, and I guess sort of in the abstract, like what sort of research went into that and why the decision to use that is such a controlling thing so early on in the book.
I think it was so that ball scene was likewise a very old scene, but for a long time it didn't seem to make any sense. Like I really liked it, and for a long time it was later. It was much later in the novel. It was in the like 3/4 mark of the novel.
Wow.
And it just wasn't working there, and it wasn't working there, and it wasn't working there. And meanwhile, I hated my beginning. And I had like 3 beginnings that I would rotate through, and I was like, nope, nope. And I tried stacking them together to make like a prologue, make my way through a prologue. And my agent was like, why do you have 3 beginnings? And I was like, okay, so that's not working. I needed a beginning that would I wanted a beginning that would just pull the reader in to this world quickly and describe the stakes of it and her situation all at once, because it's a long novel, and when you're asking someone to go in and you can't be boring. Especially with the way people who don't love opera think about opera. So they're already sort of a little like about it. Excuse me. So I already knew that clothes mattered hugely to this world back then, and to her, and to the novel, and I suppose I was having a little bit of fun with the way in which Charles Worth was considered to be like the height of luxury back then in fashion. And so there was a sort of perverse pleasure in destroying the dress at the beginning. Something that would have been, incredibly expensive and considered, and also for her to send it back to him in a box, with pas comme ça written in it, because that seemed a very diva kind of move. So I basically wanted the reader to see her performing that persona in public, and see also into why she would, like what drives her to do it, and how she thinks about it, and how she makes calculations about it, both in the long term, which is to say, she has a dressmaker's form at the dressmaker's studio, so she doesn't actually have to be there while he makes dresses for her. But she's also just like, yeah, I'm just gonna cut this off, you know, because it's horrible. So, you know, like, so that seemed like the right way to begin at the end. And I remember that when I moved it up to the front, suddenly the whole thing began to make much more sense. Immediately, it was this kind of, it's what I was just saying about, you know, a pacing problem is an information problem. You know, so the ways that I was beginning didn't provide an introduction to that sort of theater, which is really where all of this is beginning for her.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how sometimes in novels that we're writing towards a revelation, that once we get it, we realize we need to start with it.
There was a draft that I structured chronologically at the urging of my editor. It was horrible. The middle of parts of that bagged for like Act 1 and Act 5 were great, and Acts 2, 3, and 4 were like so long you didn't know why you were there or what was happening, and then I just I realized that it had to be a retrospective novel. It had to be someone who was, you know, a retrospective novel is typically structured, classically structured, so that there's a present time story that is informed by a story in the past. And the story in the past is introduced through the present time story, somewhere near the beginning, and then you move back and forth between them until there's a climax in the past story that happens right before the climax in the present time story, and sort of provides the emotional power of the two together in the present.
And you can't understand the present until the past story has resolved itself, right?
Right.
You're not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and this is a structure for novels as different as The Great Gatsby and Chris Adrian's The Children's Hospital. So it's a useful structure, you know. But there was another structure that I also used for this that I found, an episodic structure that I found from reading these Japanese historical fiction comics about ninjas, called Path of the Assassin, in which every episode has its own distinct story, but also moves you further along in a larger story. And it's, you know, it's
Right.
a very common popular entertainment
I
structure.
was gonna say
but
it's a television
it's a television
right?
format also, yeah. So that I also used as well. And that was the way of incorporating all the operatic formats, for example, into the novel.
I mean, we're beginning to see how the 10 years unfolded,
Yes.
right? So, you know, how does one not get demoralized when trying on all of these new, okay, let's categorically rearrange the story, let's try a different structure, let's take something that we thought was 3/4 the way in and now put it at the beginning. I mean, it may sound like a sort of softball question, but it's a real question, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very important as a writer not to get all of your self-esteem from your writing.
Oops.
Like, if there's anything else you're good at, you should also do that. So that you can be like, well, at least I could do a handstand today.
What else are you good at?
Right. I think, so teaching helped, writing nonfiction helped, being a person in the world, you know, I may have been reading those Japanese historical fiction comics to get through. You know, now I can justify it. I was looking for a format. Yeah, I think that's it's a big part of it is, you know, not having that just be it's tempting, you know, to put all your bets there, but it's also, it can be devastating.
Yeah, I think it's tempting when the book takes about 2 or 3 years to write, but I think it gets less tempting as the book gets further and further
Yeah.
away. Right?
I think the problem that I had was that, you know, the longer it went on, the more it was unfinished, the more that unfinished quality began to loom over me as a sort of,
Human being.
like, well, no, as a writer, so that, like, it affected my ability to apply for grants, it affected my ability to
Right.
get further teaching work, it affected my ability to just feel like I wasn't just losing my mind doing this thing for so long. And it's why, you know, last year when I was done finally and I turned it in, I thought, well, what if you did all this and then, then no one gives a crap? Whoops, that will be really horrible. So I actually like went into this publication season prepared to be treated like a cultural oddity, you know, like as some sort of strange defense. By the time November came around, it felt like the novel had already been published, and I was already past it. And I thought, that is a very interesting illusion you have constructed for yourself. Enjoy it as long as you can. So,
More questions?
I am Vince. I'm also a first-year MFA student. Just briefly, to go back a little to the retrospective
Mhm.
format you were talking about, I mean, I personally find it challenging, but jumping back and forth as you do from those two stories, how did you find techniques to make that sort of artful and smooth? I mean, you know, obviously there are chapter breaks and section breaks, but how did you find just going back and forth between the two stories to be?
it's a lot of trial and error, you know. I think there are a couple of ways that are of revising that are very helpful. One is to put pages up on a wall, if you don't know where you do that, or to lay them out on a table like this, or if you don't have a wall or a table, some floor. I've also laid it out on the floor to look at, to see how the different sections of the book relate to each other. I think it's important to print out, because I think that the longer that you just keep it as a digital file in your computer, the more it just feels like maybe it doesn't actually exist, has no shape. I work with a laptop, but that screen is very small, so I also have a monitor that I plug in and can look at like many pages at the same time. That's helpful when I'm editing, or to have several documents open. Emily St. John Mandel has a method that I think is really interesting, where she turns it into a kind of she makes it look like an ebook, and she sends it to herself and she reads it in her tablet, and that's one of the ways that she takes notes off to the side or embeds notes in it, and that helps her also. I think in a general way, when you're revising, you have to make it new to yourself somehow, you know. So part of that involves like not revising while having it in the same form that you've been drafting it in. So I would change the font and the spacing and the size, even the margins, so that it looked very different. So it looked like something a friend had sent me to read, and then would print up and mark it up with pen and take notes. I often draw diagrams of the things that I'm working on, so I can sort of, it makes sense to me that way. That's only useful for you though if that's how your brain works, you know. But you should try it if you haven't tried it. Try and like make a drawing of what you think the novel looks like when turned into a series of vectors. Because you are describing the way force moves through a form, in a sense, when you're writing fiction. So, those were some of the things that I did that helped a lot. I also kept a. So I started blogging in 2004, and I kept what I called an internal blog. Say a blog style diary that was just about the novel, and the newest entry was always at the top, and the oldest entry was at the end. And I did that because I was using one of these older forms of Microsoft Word where, anytime the document opened, it would open to page 1. So that I would make an entry with any questions that I had about the novel, any frustrations, and I would then that would be something I would make an entry at the end of work, and when I started work the next day, I would open it and look at it again, read that, and it would help me go back into what I was thinking about with the problems as quickly as possible. And that was something that I had invented around the time that I met you, for example. That was helping me. It came partly from reading about the work methods of Janet Frame, who was if you don't know her work, she was like New Zealand's greatest writer. And she would keep a list of characters and a list of places where she could see it. And she did that so that she could make sense of what she was working on. Because, you think that you'll remember all of it. Like, of course I'll remember all of my novel, but no, you won't. And that's it's something you do. Try to get as much and try to structure also as much as you can your revisions, like so that's not just you whacking at it in your computer, possibly deleting valuable things that you have no business deleting.
So I think we're gonna take our break now. Let's thank Alex. I believe pizza has arrived, and there will be time for more questions if your questions. Stephanie Grant and I co-direct with Richard McCann the Visiting Writers Series here at American University, a program of the MFA program and the Department of Literature. And some folks are scurrying in just as we get started. The first thing I want to do, aside from welcoming you here and asking you, we have seats right up at the front if you want to come and take them. I want to ask you to silence anything you own that rings or buzzes, or what did in class, what was played in class today? The Pina Colada song, somebody's phone went off. And I think that was more embarrassing than the phone going off, what the song was. We have one more event after this one, after Alexander Chee. On Wednesday, March 2nd at 8 p.m. We have a poetry reading by 3 MFA alums who have all published first books, which is pretty thrilling. Abdul Ali, Jenny Mohlberg, and Cedric Tillman. And that's going to be in the McDowell Formal Lounge here at 8 p.m. on Wednesday, March 2nd. So please mark your calendars. And as I said, if anything buzzes or rings and it's within reaching distance, make it quiet, please. One of the ways that artists make art, we understand, is to take disparate forms and smash them together. In his long-awaited second novel, The Queen of the Night, Alex Chee gives us the collision of 2 art forms, opera and the novel. A reasonable question to ask the writer who is trying to make art this way is, why? Why now? And this is a question we were asking Alex earlier, and that we can ask him again when the reading is done. What can this collision of forms show us about our lives now? Well, what do we know about opera as a form of storytelling? We know it's elaborate, that it features exceptional characters and extravagant plots. We know to expect lies and disguises, intrigues and betrayals, and last-minute escapes. Frequently, we understand there are tragic outcomes. This sounds a bit like the Republican debates. But joking aside, our contemporary lives, and I suppose here I'm talking about the times that we're living through, well, contemporary life is nothing if not operatic. And I realize as I'm speaking that I'm thinking about opera in the way that a writer does, which is to say, I'm talking about plot and event, I'm talking about what happens, and I'm forgetting about the music. I'm forgetting that what the music makes possible, which is to feel, and to feel on a grand scale. About Edinburgh, Alexander Chee's first novel, one reviewer said that it was filled with moments when agony and extraordinary beauty somehow coexist. And indeed, this description of Edinburgh seems to be the very definition of opera, agony and extraordinary beauty together, the production of feeling on a grand scale. And perhaps this is also what some contemporary fiction seems to be moving away from. With The Queen of the Night, Alexander Chee, I think, is reasserting the novel's capacity to feel, to play, to reinvent itself, just as the protagonist, Lilette Byrne, reinvents herself. Born a Minnesota farm girl, Lilette becomes a circus equestrian, a high-level courtesan, a maid to the Empress of France, a spy, and ultimately a falcon, the rarest breed of soprano. One of my students today said that it's a very novelty novel, by which he meant, I think, that it revels in its Baroque plot. I think we're often trained in the academy and sometimes in writing programs to be suspicious of plot. Plot is seen as lowbrow or mechanical, a cheap trick that is somehow beneath us. But this view forgets that plot is a sensual pleasure. It's about bodies and what happens to them. And I'm so sorry, where did I go? It's about the body and what happens to it, Lilette Byrne's body and what happens to it. It's about suspense and our own breathlessness as we read. In The Queen of the Night, Alex Chee does not withhold this pleasure, and in his generosity, he creates an extraordinary heroine, one who is neither tragic nor facilely triumphant, whose extraordinary freedom comes at great cost, as all freedom does. The novel's greatest achievement is, and not incidentally, its narrative voice. At once a 19th century voice that is period without being mannered. It's also somehow, and rather mysteriously, a contemporary voice that never, ever sounds false. Alexander Chee is a contributing editor at the New Republic and an editor-at-large at VQR, Virginia Quarterly Review, one of the most exciting contemporary literary magazines out there. His essays and stories have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Tin House, Slate, Guernica, NPR, and Out, among others. He is the winner of an NEA Fellowship and the prestigious Whiting Award. He has taught at Wesleyan University, both of our alma maters, at Amherst College, the Iowa Writers Workshop, Columbia University, Sarah Lawrence College, and the University of Texas at Austin. Currently, he lives in New York City, where he curates the Dear Reader series at Ace Hotel. And he is a former professional boy soprano and a lover of trains. We could not be more excited that he is with us tonight. Please welcome Alex Chee.
Going there.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for bringing me here to American University. It's a pleasure. And thank you for that wonderful introduction that really engaged with the novel's ideas, I'm taking increasing pride in the novel qualities of it. And it was, I remember thinking at a certain point, well, there's too many coincidences, and then I just thought, well, actually, that is the point. Which is to say, part of what this novel is about is that feeling that a coincidence provides, which is to say the feeling that something bigger than you has organized the world in such a way that this coincidence has happened, and that it means something of some kind. So I've typically read at this point from the beginning, but I thought I would start a little later in chapter 2 instead of chapter 1, going crazy. To set the novel up a little bit in case there's anyone here who's not already perhaps reading it. So the main character, Lily Byrne, has just been to a ball where she was approached by a writer who told her that he wanted her to star in an opera that was being made of his novel. And when she asked him the story of the novel or of the opera, he then provided her with a story that she thought was known only to her because it was from her life. So she forgets to ask who the composer is, he doesn't tell her, and so she sets off to find out just exactly what's going on with these revelations from her past, who might be working against her, if that is what's happening. In other words, she's trying to figure out if it's a coincidence or if it is a trap. So, in this chapter, she goes off to have dinner with the Verdis, Giuseppe and his wife, Giuseppe. Oh, and she's performing in Faust, which you have to know also. So she's completed that. The next evening, after my performance in Faust, I washed the maquillage from my face, exchanged my Marguerite prisoner cap for the wig I wore as a disguise, and easily passed by the men waiting outside the theater, fogging the streets with their 100 kinds of tobacco smoke. I arrived to my dinner with the Verdis that night, determined to get an answer on the question of the protege composer. Verdi's verdict on his talent, character, and prospects would make my decision final, I had decided. Verdi had cooked as was his custom when circumstances allowed, and Giuseppe usually made sure this was so. The maestro insisted on eating only his favorite foods, even when working abroad, and always only in the ways he could make them. He was as proud of his risotto as he was of Aida, perhaps the more so. Whatever problems he encountered as he worked with publishers, theater owners, or sopranos, his wife knew the recipes to these various foods were the recipe to him. To eat something else would literally unmake him. So he traveled crated down with dry risotto, macaroni, and tagliatelle. Anything that could not be bought would be arranged for by Giuseppe, whatever the cost. To dine with him was to dine on food prepared either by him personally or by his chef, who usually came with him, nearly as dear to him as his wife, who did not much go to restaurants. When I entered their hotel suite, I was greeted by Giuseppe, who took my hand in hers and led me to the dining room, while poking at my wig and laughing. "Who is this woman of mystery, and where is our Lillier?" she said, her voice deepening as if she were on stage. From somewhere out of sight, Verdi laughed in answer as he finished some final preparation. Giuseppe and Giuseppina were slim, gray in the same ways, oddly twinned, her profile more Roman than his. His eyes were darker and intent, filmed over as if by ghosts. They were like sentinels of a kind, one who watched for the living, the other the dead. Verdi had lost his first wife and children when he was a young man, and was rumored to have fathered a secret daughter on Giuseppina, born to them before their marriage. Giuseppe herself was said to have 2 other children back from when she was the imperious soprano lover of Donizetti, but I had never met any of them. When I came to see them, I liked to pretend I was the secret daughter, abandoned and then found again. I wanted to belong to them forever. No one could fit easily between them, though. A few had tried. I sat with them at the small, elegant table laid out in their suite, relieved by the familiar smell of his macaroni. Giuseppe asked me about the ball of the night previous. Had I really returned in a new gown, and why? For the Jewel song, of course, I said. A costume change. And I winked. I was inspired by the way the ball resembled the Fifth Act ballet. Bertie looked at her urgently before he poured champagne for us all and made a toast. Do you know Faust and the Fifth Act ballet? He said. We laughed, raised our glasses, and drank. A ballet is nothing to add lightly, he said. Ballo and Mashra, did you know it was not always set in America? I was forced to set it in America so as not to offend a prince. An American masked ball. I'd never heard of such a thing. I did not, I said, amused. I was to perform this next for him in Milan to open the season at La Scala in December with it. Where was it set previously? I asked. Sweden? But the offended parties were Napolitanos. Napoleon III, also strangely. Usually only minded if an opera was overlong. We laughed. A few courses were served, and then he asked me if I might agree to another opera altogether, this as he set the plates full of risotto in front of us. I Mazzadieri, he said. I smiled and looked down to my risotto. This offer surprised me. When he asked me to dinner that night, I thought it was to discuss some further detail of the Milan production. I knew this other opera a little. I would be killed by bandits instead of dying in my cell this time. And I was about to say yes, as I usually would, to such an offer, and then did not. Speak freely, my dear, he said. Something bothers you. How to say it? I was tired of dying this season. Tired of playing so long at death and madness. My initial hesitation began there and was joined by the irony of his granting an old wish, acting as if I did belong to him, even as a new one had appeared. The idea of originating a role written by a protege of his had taken root in me over the course of the day, and had even grown into a romantic fable, the more plausible to me as I sat here. Giuseppe had met Verdi when he was a struggling young composer, beginning his career with Nabucco. She had created both the lead soprano role and her life with him, leaving behind the more famous Donizetti for the handsome young composer. Composers often courted singers with original roles in operas, as they both knew well. I thought of myself as a Giuseppe then, waiting for my own Giuseppe to appear, and hoping, perhaps, that he had. But I had not yet met this new Giuseppe. They, it seemed, had. They knew who he was. Couldn't say no to Verdi, though, especially for an opera without a score, written by the protege I had meant to ask after next. He would eventually find out, and this would insult him. And so I could not say yes, and I could not say no, and I could not ask my question, not right then. I could lie, the thought came. But as quickly came the thought that to lie to him was a grave sin against our friendship, for he would know. What's more, I had no lie prepared. This is a surprise. We were so sure you'd be pleased, Giuseppe said. She raised an eyebrow. And they sat back in their chairs again. Verdi held his glass to the side near the candle flame. And along the tablecloth, a deep red shadow pooled. My novels, I heard the writer say in my memory of the night before, they all come true. And I knew what I would say. As you can tell, I said I am afraid to consent. The lie was still forming on my tongue when a feeling came, like that premonitory trill of the string section in an opera, the warning of danger. I feel it brings a curse, I said. Verdi squinted and looked up. The red light from his glass flashed along the pressed white linen tablecloth. I fear the roles I take come true, I said, condemn me to repeat the fates of my characters in life. This I worded as a suspicion, for I already regretted this lie, which had seemed small and ridiculous just a moment before, but still useful somehow. And now was an explosion, the words still in the air around me like smoke, a smoke that could grow to cover my entire life. Verdi's face was now so grave, so solemn, I was about to contradict myself, or laugh, or agree to take the role if only to please him, when Giuseppe reached for my hand. She glanced at her husband, who did not meet her eyes, and then she leaned very close to me. "Of course they do, my dear," she said. "This is why I have sung nothing since marrying." Verdi put his glass down. "Cursed. I wonder, what have you dared?" He stroked his beard as he met my eyes, a faint smile on his face. "The great tragedies are told of the families who caught the attention of the gods with their hubris. Struck down but known forever to us, the house of Atreus, for example," he said, "but perhaps you are cursed. Perhaps when we do as we do," he said, "the gods learn something or are entertained. Certainly we do not." I pulled my free hand to him and kissed it, as if I had bid him good night. "Take very good care," he said. "Our prayers are with you. I do understand. And if this means you must withdraw from other production, please tell me." I sat silent before them, humiliated, unable to answer until I remembered the matter of my other mission and decided to proceed as plainly as possible. "What is this I hear of a protege?" I asked. "A young composer, a recent winner of the Prix de Rome?" Verdi said nothing, but stood and removed our plates, and then returned to the table with grappa, which I took. "It's nothing to speak of," he said. "I'm sure I just made the mistake of doing someone a favor, and now he's telling people he's my protege." He exchanged the briefest look with Giuseppe before turning back to me. "If I had as many proteges as I'm said to have, I would command an army," he said. There was no avoiding any longer that the evening, and perhaps more, was spoilt, and the only rescue fork began with my exit. I excused myself. They brought my cape. We exchanged muted kisses goodnight, and I hired a driver home. As the little calèche made its way to my home through the dark, past the Tuileries, the Palais Royal, on its way to the Avenue de l'Opera, I pushed back into the seat, and the wood and hide creaked. In the wind I could smell the mushroom whiff of dead leaves and earth. He had lied to me, you see. That was clear from the look he'd exchanged with Giuseppe. He had lied to me and was warning her not to contradict him. This had the effect of telling me the protege was real. The new mystery, as I left, was as to why he'd lied. And as to what I had dared that might offend the gods, well, I had lied to Verdi, and he knew. The Paris I met when I first arrived during the last days of the Second Empire and Napoleon III was a series of ascents that looked at first like descents. Going down brought you up. Success to Scandale. The women I met then dressed as if choosing weapons. Their balls, parties, and dinners were a series of duels and melees. In the salons and ateliers of the city, outfitters for a vast assassins' guild, too decorated by half. A girl could enter this world as a grisette, taking in laundry, and in a week or two be at Worth for a gown. 2 weeks more, leave at dawn in the carriage of an Austrian industrialist, having been stolen from the bed of the emperor, just to be protected from the empress. Should be returned within the month if the industrialist were either assassinated for presumptuousness, or titled for his rescue of the emperor's happiness. Everyone I met had the look of seeing a story repeated in front of them, actors in a rehearsal on a marked stage, the laundress, the couturier, the industrialist, the emperor, the empress. As I passed each, I soon saw this world was new only to me, and when I was done with my turn, I had found my place and learned to listen for the wooden shoes of the next girl as she came through. Napoleon III was now dead in his mausoleum in England, the Second Empire replaced by the Third Republic. But I could still make out the shapes of the new grisettes in the dark, walking and waiting for their lovers, careful of the police, studying me and my calèche carefully as I shifted from foot to foot, as I once had, and wondering how to become one such as me. I nearly saluted from where I sat. By one unhappy thought, the chorus sings in the Cheeto Evermore, 1,000 joys are lost. Perhaps I told myself I could write to Verdi in the morning and accept, I could tell him it was foolishness and beg his forgiveness, but each time I thought it, there stood Madame Verdi, with her blithe assurance that my lie was the truth, greeting me at what I did not know would be this next station in my journey. Her quick acknowledgement of my little lies, some long-standing secret truth among singers, did not reassure me, though. Instead, it made the lie seem like a spell I'd been tricked into casting on myself, one that made it so, as if I had cursed myself. The music for Umbala and Mashra, as well as Imas Nadieri, waited on my tray at home. No doubt sent over before or during our dinner. He had been so certain. There was a note, a short brava, and his looping signature below. I prepared to send the one back and then could not just yet. In Umbala and Mashra, my character, Amelia, was dishonored but would live. The orphan Amalia in Imas Nadieri was murdered. They were like so many of the roles I played, roles close to my life. Procession of orphans, grisettes, courtesans, wrong lovers, disgraced ones. But Amelia, the American, Amalia, the orphan, they were very close, like some strange duo that was really the same girl leading the way. The letter E and Amelia changing to an A, like a tiny mask, just for me. All of them, perhaps, leading to this next role, if I agreed to do it, as the settler's daughter, in the Serve du Monde issue. Me as I once had been. What was her fate? Was her ending happy or sad? The writer had said something about an angel and love and hell, of course. Why was there never an opera that ended with a soprano who was free? The first thing determining the career of a singer is her Fach. The word is German and sounded like fate to me the first time I heard it. It is a singer's fate, for it describes a singer's range and the types of roles the singer will sing. Some soprano tones are associated with virtue, others with seduction, others with grief. If your voice is a collection of the highest notes, you are to play the good girl. If your voice reaches only to the near heights, you are the spurned one, or the dishonored. A bit lower, and you are the rival, or the seductress, and still lower the maid or matron. To move from the confines of your Fach was to risk sounding suddenly as if there had been no education in singing at all. The voice loses all its qualities. Mine was a voice that sounded at first as if it did not have the capacity for high notes, until they emerged, surprising with great force. A voice for expressing sorrow, fear, and despair. The tragic soprano is what I was called, also known as a falcon. Nothing to fear from a fate that was already yours then, except perhaps that it would never leave you. The pioneer equestrian, remembered by Simonet and his composer friend, first took her steps out into the streets of Paris when she was 16 years old. As a member of the Cajun Maidens and the Wonders of the Canadian Frontier, a small traveling cirque. The Emperor Napoleon III had emptied out the world's pockets for the audiences at the Exposition Universelle of 1867. And as France was especially mad for stories of America and Canada, settlers and Indians, horses and beasts from the woods, we came to supply them. We came to Paris for the pleasure of the Emperor. Him, his appetites, his reign, all controlling me, even then. We were 3 Palomino horses and Mela the Rowan, with an actual Iroquois for our Indian chief, a Russian Jewess from St. Petersburg for the Indian princess, and a troop of 5 pounds, 4 brothers from Minsk, and a woman from Portugal, who was certainly not their sister, as their tribe. The magician was from Palermo and got himself up as the medicine man, and there were 3 trapeze artists for the spirits of the north, 2 women and 1 man, who all hailed from Poland and were, I think, lovers, all 3. A Swedish giant, a complete gentleman, wore a suit of fur and a false monster head, and was called the Wendigo, summoned forth by the medicine man. The show stars were the Cajun Maidens, 5 powerfully built sisters, all truly from Quebec, who began their routine as if doing ordinary household chores but with extraordinary tools, sweeping a broom the size of a husband, balancing firewood on their head, and then led up to axe juggling, knife throwing, somersaults on and off of horses. Together they were my family for 5 months. The show told the story of a young woman's escape from captivity, mine. I played the settler's daughter, adopted by the Cajun maidens after having been captured by the Indians and raised in their wild ways. Who said I could fire a bow, an arrow, or a rifle, track an animal through the woods, and while I'd lost my English living among the Indians, I could still sing one song, a song my mother taught me, which I came out and sang it around at the end. By appearance, I am often thought to be Bohemian or Italian, but sometimes French, English, or Scandinavian. As a girl, I was slender, small, but with a large head and features, large brown eyes, dark red hair, nearly brown. Any kind of beauty I had seemed to me to be in my hair, and when I wore it bound close to my head in braids, it was like a secret. The settler's daughter was a part invented by the show boss. He'd gone looking for one to replace the girl who'd left. I never knew her, and no one ever spoke of her. The story he'd invented, he adapted for me because there was no other way to explain this girl he'd found in New York could sing but not speak. I was silent because I believed I was damned. I was sure I was a foul liar before God, a girl who tried to invent a miracle, and he'd taken my whole family, except me, to show me what he thought of me. The one song I sang, I believed, was all that the Lord had left me. It was the song my mother had loved to hear, the one noise I thought he'd let me make and live. As for why I joined, it was because I could do this, and I swore only this, until I had been safely returned my mother's people, her family in Lucerne. When I arrived in Paris, I thought I'd nearly made it there. The girl I was when I arrived in Paris came believing herself cursed as well. If my voice really was cursed, I was sure it was that one, somehow still with me all these years. She's coming for me out of the dark, the girl I once was. She hasn't spoken in years past remembering. I can't tell you her name, and she won't either. Not for shame of my family's modest origins. I became something they couldn't imagine, something they would have kept me from becoming. And that, it seems to me, was always in my nature to become. They would not be proud of me. I never belonged to them, though they tried. To truly tell you my story, we start not with the settler's daughter then, but with the one before her, the one who hid inside her, who walked down to the pier, where she found a tent full of horses and music that took her in. My invented miracle began as a prank. It was only to punish my mother for punishing me. I was the child of a Scottish father and a Swiss mother who'd met when they came to settle America for God, Methodist settlers farming the new state of Minnesota. My father received his plot in 1862, given land in the Homestead Act, and we moved from Ohio, even as the Dakota War began that summer, and the Civil War burned the lands farther east. It could have been my fate to have lived out the story I would later perform, but instead, we passed these conflicts strangely unharmed. So much so that my mother and father said we were blessed, and so I was allowed to grow up to be a girl approaching the age of my confirmation and First Communion in the summer of 1866. I was a tomboy to the despair of my mother, whom I loved. While the singers I knew were studying in convent schools, I was chasing storms on our horses and drinking the rain. To prepare me and to tame me, my mother tested me on my Bible subjects, the names of the apostles, the trials of Jesus, the story of creation, and when she was done, said, "Well, I'm glad you at least know the name Jesus." No other God before me, my mother quoted to me. Do you think when your time comes and you appear before the Lord, He'll want you to sing, and He'll forgive all the rest? It was, in fact, what I was sure was true. I loved to go to church with her, but it was only to sing the hymns. This little church was my first theater. When the time came to sing, I was the very picture of an eager Christian, standing first out of the whole congregation, hymnal open, waiting impatiently for the pastor's wife to pick out the refrain on the church's piano. But when the singing was over, I'd sit numb for the rest of the service, until my mother pulled my sleeve to show we were leaving. As we left, the congregation would come to say to her what a voice I had, And wasn't she so proud of me? And I would glow beside her, beaming at her, waiting for her to be proud of me. She would sometimes reach out and tuck my hair behind my ears, as if it had come loose. I loved my mother, but I did not love God. For reasons unknown to me still, I'd never quite taken to the idea of God. At this age, I could only imagine the words we said in church, going off into the empty air, in the presence of my mother's assertions about the Lord. I tried to assume the same gravity that everyone around me had, but whenever I said, Lord my God, I never believed it. I knew myself to be a liar. I did it only because I loved her, but I was not sincere, and she could tell, and so dismayed her, and she punished me as proud. The next Sunday, after my failure at my Bible test, she met me at the door with a piece of black ribbon and velvet, and she tied it in place over my mouth. You'll wear this today and think of how, and you know what you should know as a proper Christian, you can sing in church again, she said, and pushed my hair back into place around the collar of my coat. Your voice is a gift from God. It deserves to be treated with respect, as does the Lord. As we climbed down from our buggy in the yard by the church, the other members stared, but my mother had told her friends of her plan, and they quickly murmured the story to those who didn't know, so that no one asked me about it, not even the pastor, when I shook his hand at the door. I noticed he threw occasional anxious glances my way, but my mother's stern regard seemed to quiet him. I perhaps made a mistake in telling you it's a gift, this voice of yours, my mother said to me as she removed the ribbon gag at home and folded it into her sewing kit. But it's a test as well. There's no gift like yours without a test. The weeks leading up to the ceremony drifted by with a terrible slowness. Each Sunday I made my way past the staring children and sat out the service. Each week I sat at the table with the prayer book at home and recited the prayers to my mother as she cooked dinner, as if I were praying to her, as if she were the angry and vengeful God, her back to me, while she tended to the fry pan. Unlike God's, her replies to my prayers were straightforward. Very good, she'd say. Again. And then, mercifully, the long-awaited day came. I dressed in a new dress. I appeared in the church as I once had, my mouth uncovered. I stood before the pastor and repeated the prayers in a steady voice, and then he said, Body and blood of Christ. And he took the bread and the wine and put it on my tongue, and then it was done. I went back to my seat next to my family as the pastor's wife made her unsteady way through the introit. I turned to see my mother, her head bent low, but her eyes on me, and my father smiling. But my brothers, they stared at me as if my troubles might come for them. I took the hymnal, flipped it open, and began to sing. I hadn't sung in so long, the noise of my voice startled me, but it was there, not only undiminished, but perhaps even changed to something more powerful than before. I wanted more than anything to use it, but instead I held it back, tightening my throat slightly. It made a deliberately thin, weak noise that blended quietly like the noise of another girl. I could tell, for all I was trying to blend my voice, that my mother heard my every effort. I stood out even now. But as the second chorus began, she looked over at me and nodded her head, pleased at last, again. A few days later, I took one of our horses and rode to the farthest edge of our property, past the long fields of new rye and hay, until I reached a long hill that sloped down sharply and hid everything below. I tied the horse carefully to a tree and walked down until I was sure I was out of sight. This was my favorite place. I wanted to hear my new voice. I was angry at being punished for what I was sure was God's only gift to me, and yet I was ashamed still to sing in front of my mother, afraid the pleasure I took would be seen as pride. And as I often sang when I was sad as well, I could not even console myself as I once had, not in the house. So here I was. The song I chose for my test was a song my father sang often, a sea shanty. I later learned there was more to it than this, that this was the fragment he sang over and over. What will you do, love, when I am going, with white sails blowing, the seas beyond? I like to imagine my young father pacing the deck at night on his crossing, singing this song. I sang it to myself there and sang it again, falling into it, wandering into the woods as I did so. I imagined leaving my family, leaving the town, leaving it all, and never returning. I saw their sad, empty days without me. When they missed me, they'd be sorry for how they treated me. My mother would cry for having made me wear that gag. When I came out of the woods, I began to head back to the horse. When I heard it whicker, I looked to see my mother at the top of the hill. Is it to make a fool of me then? She said. No, Mother, I said, as unhappy to have been caught as I was to have made her sad, for she looked as though I'd insulted her. I can't have you running off like this, she said. You're not a child anymore. You have responsibilities. We're to be making your trousseau in case you forgot. I protested, but she would have none of it. After that, as punishment, I was to wear the gag for another week. All the time, my father asked of my mother that night back at the house. We were eating dinner. All the time, she said, except at meals. Her voice has gone to her head, and that will be trouble. The other children say she's possessed, my little brother said. Frank was his name. If we hear her sing, we'll all be possessed as well. Is it true then? Thomas, the older one, asked. It's just foolishness and gossip, my mother said. Don't repeat it or I'll make a gag for you as well. My parents left then to speak with each other out of our hearing. Is it true? Thomas repeated at me. I glared and then nodded. The boys leapt up and cleared the table. Now if I wanted to scare them, I had only to make as if I were going to pull down the gag and look at them meaningfully. And while I hated not being able to speak, I enjoyed their fear. I liked how at church the other families stared at me, liked that the boys who once chased me now stayed back, afraid. This was also pride. My mother noted it, and then said, 1 more week. I don't like it, my father said to me the following week as we washed our hands for dinner. It's not right. I'm working on your mother. But she has it in her head that this will cure you. I'm not sure how we're to know you're cured. I started to cry when he said this. Can you take it off at night, he asked me. I nodded. Well then, I suppose that's a blessing at least. That night I heard him argue with her. I sat hidden on the stairs and listened. It's you who ought to wear it, he said. She's a girl, not a freak, but now she's being said to be possessed. Is that what you want for her? How are we to get her a husband if the men think she's cursed? You haven't seen the wicked pride in her, my mother said. You haven't seen the wicked pride in you. My mother began to cry, which startled me. It's not right what you're doing, he said. It's not right at all. Nothing good will come of it. Despite my fantasies of running away, I loved them too much to do it. I made another plan. That night, as I slept, I went to where my mother kept a kettle on the stove. The water in it was still warm. I walked with it to my bed and soaked my sheets, careful not to wake my brothers asleep together in the bed across from me. Careful not to wake them until my nightgown was wet, and my hair as well. I lay down in the bed then, and with great purpose, rolled onto the floor, landing heavily with a crash. My brother Frank woke up, and then got down from the bed to investigate me where I lay, very still, my eyes closed. He touched my forehead, rubbing my wet hair with his little fingers. Thomas, he said, wake up. Wake up and get Mom and Dad. Tell them she's got the fever. Soon I heard my parents come in, get her downstairs. My mother ordered my father, good Lord, her bed is soaked. I'll have to hang the bedding out to dry. I'll wash it in the morning. I kept my eyes closed as my father carried me, not wanting to let on. If he was to look me in the eye, he'd know. I was certain. When the doctor came the next day, I pretended my voice was gone, and he determined me to have been rendered mute, at least temporarily, perhaps permanently. There's nothing wrong with her now, he said. Well, my mother said, this was God's will. She surprised me then, and wept. I prayed for the good Lord to take away your pride, she said. I suppose he has taken away mine also. Whatever shame I felt before was nothing compared to this. As she wept next to my bed, she asked me to forgive her. I could not decide which was worse, to continue to pretend or to reveal the pretense. I decided to take my time, to act as if the voice had returned slowly. Having planned this miracle, I would plan another. My parents, in the meantime, returned to being loving with each other. The children stopped staring. My brothers no longer feared me and played with me again. Everyone was kind and told me how much they missed my voice at church. All returned to how it had been before, except for me. Then the real fever came and took them from me, everyone. Thank you. So, I'm happy to answer questions. Do you have questions? Yes.
When you started your research, what was one thing that you just couldn't wait to find out about?
I've been obsessed with dresses for a long time, so the clothes, definitely. I think the most exciting part of the research involved a last-minute trip to Paris when I discovered that the Fashion Museum in Paris was throwing an exhibit of the Empress Eugenie's clothes that they had, like pretty much everything that they had available at the time. And it was for a limited engagement. It wasn't one of those exhibits that would last for like a half year. So I had to go or not see it. And so I checked, I think it was Orbitz or Priceline or something, and I found a $215 round trip ticket to Paris on Air India. And I was like, not only do I get to go, I get to eat awesome Indian food. I gotta do it. So sometimes with these big flights, they have to fill the smaller portions, and so every now and then you can get lucky with one of those kinds of discounts. So there I was, and there I went, and that was pretty amazing because there were lots of things that and I had some pretty terrific books about the clothes, but there were lots of things that you would never know without seeing them, about how they were made, or how you might put them on, or any of those things. And yeah, it was as if someone knew. It was a coincidence. As if someone knew that I was writing a novel and needed that. Because there was also at the same time another show that did even more of her clothes, set up at Compiègne, which is another location of the novel. And so there were mannequins dressed as her in the various rooms of the palace. And that was sort of ridiculously perfect for my purposes. Owen.
So, I'm really interested in how you moved from the actual person, Jenny Lind,
Jenny Lind, yeah.
to Liliet. How did you sort of veer from historical fact? And then my second question has to do with language. So, like when she first, because I was surprised when I began it that she was actually American. I thought she was going to be French.
Right.
And so, how did she navigate language when she got there? I mean, her French is not that good, for a long time, and I was wondering how you imagined she was navigating language-wise.
So the answer to the first question is the difference was almost immediate because what happened was I ran into a friend, a writer, the late David Rakoff, who was in a writing group of mine at the time. We were in a group together. He told me a story, for whatever reason, about Jenny Lind. About how she had retired at a young age, and she retired at the age of 29 from the stage, which for a singer is very young, given how much training you have to do. And she retired saying that opera was immoral. That was why she was retiring. And then P.T. Barnum wrote to her and said, "Would you consider doing a farewell tour of the Americas?" She said, "I will if you give me $500,000 advance against ticket sales." Which I think was her way of saying, like, yeah, I don't want to do it. Just like in retrospect as I think about it. And then he showed up with the money, which at the time, in 1850, $500,000 was really a lot more than it is now. And that sum now as an advance against ticket sales would be considered large. So he brought her to the U.S. and her farewell tour lasted for 2 years, and they both became very rich people. In the process, she more than earned back that advance. And I just assumed that there was a circus because of P.T. Barnum. I didn't know that much about P.T. Barnum, I just knew the myth. really. I didn't know any of the other details, and I suppose this was possible in part because I did not have a smartphone at the time. But essentially, like, I left him and I took the subway home to where I could get to a computer, which was at my apartment in Brooklyn. So it was about, we were in the East Village, it took about 45 minutes total. During that whole time, I had this image in my head of an opera singer who retires into a circus, and of her traveling, thinking about her past. And when I got home and searched for her online, I realized that I'd made a terrible mistake, that there wasn't a circus, and I was disappointed. So I liked my idea better. And then I thought, oh, that would be the novel, if that was what it was. In terms of how she came to be American, that was also immediate. I thought Jenny Lynn's nickname, so opera singers typically had what the French call a sobriquet. And Jenny's was the Swedish Nightingale, and that seemed so ridiculous. It seemed like only an American would name themselves that. So I imagined this kind of like swagger to her that didn't actually exist. She really was from Sweden, actually, and trained in the Royal Music Academy there. But my singer was a fake. She was lying about maybe everything, and that was part of what was interesting to me. So I jokingly called her like Jenny Lynn's shadow that kind of fell off her and ran away. And then in terms of the language stuff, that to me was a really interesting problem. And I think what was interesting, like at one point I was able to research circuses at the museum, the Ringling Brothers Museum in Saratoga, Florida. And that was where I learned how they had a kind of mixed up salad of different languages that they used to communicate with each other. That was actually a lot like the one that Pauline jokingly called her salad of tongues.
Because it was so international.
Yeah, exactly. People just kind of worked it out. There wasn't anything super formal about it, and so that also was interesting to me as a possibility of mitigating circumstance. And Paris was such an international city too at the time. People would certainly not deal with you if you didn't speak French or be rude to you, but you might still make your way through because there wasn't only French people. So it became, all those complications just became part of I just built them into the story as much as I could to make it interesting and challenging. And that became where her whole pretense of being mute was useful, because it allowed other people to speak around her and her to just sort of listen and figure out what she wanted to do within that. Yes?
So, one of the elements of your novel that I found the most compelling was the voice. In that it was almost a contemporary voice in a place that isn't contemporary at all. And I'm thinking of a lot of different, really, very popular and compelling culture that's out there today. I'm thinking of things like Hamilton, where stories of people in the past that are told in the present thing of today. And I was wondering, how did you conceive that voice, and how, in terms of process, how did you make sure that voice didn't falter?
I think it's important to keep in mind with historical fiction that if it's too authentic, it's off-putting, and then the reader doesn't go there all the way. The reader has a fantasy of themselves that they want authenticity, but how that's conveyed actually involves an illusion of authenticity, which is provided by creating an idiom that is a mix of the past and the present, so that it has that atmosphere or but is not actually starkly ancient or antique. And you know, that's it's a surface that's related to something called impressionism in the service of realism. That is a very common thing that happens in American fiction. It's a product of you know, sort of reinvention of the ways in which stories were being told by, it was done by, I mean, I think of Joseph Conrad and Ford Madox Ford as being the men who were, the writers who were like, we are going to reinvent fiction so it is more psychologically real. Yeah. And they came up with a lot of conventions that we all sort of use now, whether we ever read them or whether we even think about it, such as beginning further into the story and then moving back in time into the background of the story and then moving through to the development and the climax and the ending. Anytime you're watching a film and you see a date and timestamp that's like, you know, yesterday, 3:44 p.m., you know, and then a car explodes, like that's Ford Madox Ford. So, where was I going with this? Yes. So, what I was doing was, I was not interested in writing a realist novel. The scale of that would be too horrible. I would probably still be writing it if I was. What I was interested in was something that moved in between realism and fable. That was like a fable about history, in a sense, as a way of arguing with history, and then also arguing with the present. And so that's, in terms of the voice, I read a lot of things continuously that, I read a lot of Colette. Colette was very helpful to me. I read a lot of Jean Rhys as well. That was also useful. I wanted something in between those two voices. I also read the Diaries of Anais Nin, and I read the Journals of the Brothers Goncourt. So those were the sort of texts that I would always go back to continuously, and they were useful in terms of the world that I was trying to describe as well. Like Colette, her career takes place at is definitely Third Republic / you know, but she grew up with the memory of these women I was writing about. You know, she was sort of their heir, in a sense. As was Anais Nin. Jean Rhys was a sort of perfect alien in Paris. Kind of, she had a sort of, her stories in particular were very useful. There's a kind of rough and tumble woman in them who's sometimes quite rude and violent and explosive, which was basically her. But you know, so those were the keeping those in close range helped considerably.
We have time for maybe one more question? We have time for one more question?
Hi.
Hi. So you were discussing at the beginning how the structure kind of deals thematically with the opera, but I'm wondering, when you have so much research, not only in your plot line but also in your structure, how do you balance that and keep it from overwhelming the reader? You're balancing this world you've created with this heavy research.
Everything just has to have a purpose, really. It's you have to keep. There's a way that she narrates to the reader that is, sometimes she inserts a little bit of foreshadowing, or you know, there's a way in which she stays present as a, like you're watching her try to figure something out, try to understand something, and I think that's, just keeping that in mind then helps the reader understand why you're in the different places that you're in. That was what I set out to do, at least. If you're not careful about telling the reader why you're going where you're going, they'll leave you. They just won't keep reading. That's the gamble. So there's some readers that will follow you with like the sparsest possible reasons to continue, and then there's some who won't follow you if you lay it on too thick. So you have to figure it out. That is what your balance is, that you're happiest with.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.